Howdy y'all, and welcome back to my little corner of the world, and also this year's first and possibly only edition of I Am a Champion, my video series about my love for all things Olympics and Paralympics. As you may have noticed, we're already into the Paralympics, which means the Olympics have already ended, and it's been about 2.5 weeks, and here we are in the Paralympics. Now, those of you who don't know, the Paralympics actually does not mean paralyzed Olympics, but rather parallel Olympics, meaning it runs parallel to the able-bodied version of the amazing sport that is the Olympics. I could go into a whole lot of history, but it would take a whole lot of time. What I wanted to talk to you about today is actually some major differences that you will see if you happen to somehow find yourself watching the Paralympics, which I highly encourage you do. So here you go. Here are some big differences. First of all, in the Olympic sports, you have men's and women's events, and sometimes they have team events that have both men's and women's competing in the same event. In the Paralympics, however, you not only have men's and women's, and there are actually a few sports that have men and women competing in the same teams, but you also have to have classifications or categories because there are so many disabilities that all of these Paralympians are competing with. So how do they deal with that? Because you have people with lower limb problems, people with upper limb problems, people with visual impairments. Well, there you go. You have at least 3 categories or 3 different disciplines that are sometimes competed within their own ability classes. Lower limb 1 and 2 for snowboarding, meaning more or less impairment within the lower limb classification issues. And you have upper limb, upper body issues. So that can be anything from having a loss of an arm to having neurological issues that may make it hard for them to use the arm. Sometimes you'll even see the arm inside their shirt or their jersey. And then you have visual impaired, which usually have their own classification and actually do the sport with other visually impaired individuals. Now within all 3 of those, you might even have that broken down even more. As I said, lower limb in snowboarding has 2 different classifications, 1 and 2. Upper limb, different Paralympic sports will have multiple breakdowns of that as well. And even visually impaired sometimes has multiple classifications within that. This particular Paralympics, this winter Paralympics, they're pretty much dealing with lower limb 1 and 2, upper body impairment, and visually impaired. And they're classing those together. And how do you even that out when you have somebody with a whole missing limb and somebody that's just got issues dealing with the limb? Maybe it's a neurological condition. Well, how they deal with that is another thing altogether, which is to actually change the percentage of how fast the clock is running for each individual for how much disability they have within their classification. So when you see any of the sports within the Paralympics and you see on the bottom, let's see, it's the bottom right-hand side when you're looking at it. I hope I'm doing this the right way. I'm dyslexic, so this makes it really hard to figure out what you see. But the bottom right-hand side, you'll not only see how well they are doing with their time, but you'll see a percentage mark. That percentage says how much they might have had to differentiate the time difference for that particular disability. Bet you didn't know. So those are just a few of the many differences. Ice hockey, you might notice, or sledge hockey, does not have a women's hockey team. Why? Well, there are a few different takes on this. My understanding is that there are some sled hockey teams that actually have men and women in them because there really weren't enough in their country to have a men's and women's team. But there is quite a movement right now to actually make women's sled hockey a reality in the Paralympic movement, the Paralympics themselves in coming years. So that's an interesting fact for you. In fact, the basketball team in the Summer Paralympics, not many of the teams have a female on their team, but It is men's and women's. Oh, I'm sorry. It's not basketball. My bad. It is rugby. It's rugby. Any of the rugby teams on the Paralympics summer, you might be able to find a woman on the team. It just depends, because there isn't a Paralympic women's rugby team. There aren't enough of them to actually compile their whole team, but they are allowed to compete with the men sometimes. So those are some of the big differences between the Olympics and the Paralympics. I mean, of course, the obvious big difference is you have disabled individuals in one, and you don't normally have disabled individuals in the other. Paralympics versus Olympics. So yeah, my favorite sport right now, both in the Olympics and the Paralympics, has to be snowboard cross. I'm loving it. So far, I've just watched the qualifications rounds, and I am hooked. I got to see this for the first time 4 years ago, and I highly recommend it. They have a lot of different sports in the Paralympics that are really fun to watch. My dad's really wanting to watch the curling. Yes, they have curling. Yes, they have ice hockey. Most of them, however, will be either snowboarding or skiing in disciplines. I look forward to talking to you, hopefully, maybe, more about what I love about the Paralympics and their differences in future videos. But for now, I hope that you can go and find this somewhere on television, whether it's on NBC on the weekend nights. Check your local listings, because they are not being very upfront about when they're going to air these things. Or if you have USA or Peacock, go and try and find it. Please let them know this wants to be watched, that we want this seen, because this is huge that we are able to have a disabled sporting event on television. This is huge, and I love it. And I love that it is finally getting to be seen more, and I just hope that in following years, in coming years, that this can be seen more and more and more, and it can be normal to be talked about, and we can all be excited for it. God bless y'all. Ciao for now. Bye.